Everybody on the East Coast, good afternoon. Some of you further to the west, late morning, or further to the east, later afternoon. Thank you for joining C2ES today for our low carbon business, how climate ambition leads to job creation and economic growth. Part of C2ES's work is to build business support for effective climate policies. And shortly after Congress convened and the new President Biden, was inaugurated, C2ES issued a report on a number of climate-related policy recommendations to drive innovation, to reduce emissions, to strengthen resilience, and to address climate justice and support the economic recovery needed as we come out of the pandemic. That effort actually was the culmination of almost 2 years of discussions between C2ES teams, other businesses that we work with on a day-to-day basis, and looking at their input on how to decarbonize their industries and what that dynamic would need to be between policy and their ambition. This is part of our larger effort called Climate Innovation 2050, where we are looking at what it will take to decarbonize the United States economy by the middle of the century, and how to do that in the near term, and what ambition do we need in the near term. You know, the Biden administration has embarked on a whole government approach to tackling the climate crisis, and they've made achieving a zero emission greenhouse gas by the middle of the century as a national priority. The virtual climate leaders conferences and summit is happening later this week, which is a sort of a beginning of the United States re-entering the arena as a global leader in climate change and climate change policy and ambition. We're expecting that sometime during this summit, there'll be the announcement of a new nationally determined contribution for the United States, and it's expected that that will be quite ambitious on the path to zero emissions and carbon neutrality in the middle of the century. The absence of some federal leadership in the last number of years has really caused the United States to fall behind a little bit in our own work and getting our own economy to take advantage of the decarbonization opportunities. So we're encouraging, it is very encouraging. In fact, we're seeing this already in the newspapers today and over the last week, and we'll probably see more between now and the end of the week. Businesses are continuing to come out publicly supporting strong climate action and taking on some responsibility themselves. And we'll hear a little bit more from some of those businesses today. You know, with the return of federal leadership, I think it's important to know that intention is not enough, that we are going to need an aggressive target, and we're going to need, and this is really important and part of what we're talking about today, a strong federal government and business partnership, because one can't do this without the other. There's going to be a mutual support to achieve these goals. And so achieving these an ambitious target by 2030, in line with that 2050 net zero goal, is going to require all sectors of the economy to be working together and collaborating with the government. We have a great event for you today, and we're looking forward to your questions later in the day. But this collaboration is going to be a keynote as we go through this. Shortly after I'm done here, Kaveh Gilampour, our Vice President of International Strategies, will start us off by talking a little bit about the context internationally of United States ambition. We will then have Kate Larson from the Rodian Group, and I'll introduce her in a minute. From there, we'll have representatives of General Electric, Duke Energy, IBM, and Shell to talk about what an ambitious NDC means to them and what they are currently working on. But before we go to that next step of our speakers, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here. First, this event is being recorded. You might have noted that already. And it's important that you know that we're doing that. But when we're done, and if you want to share what happens here, we will be posting this on C2ES's YouTube page. The format today will be short presentations by the panelists, followed by a moderated discussion with the panelists, with me as the moderator. And then we will leave time at the end to make sure that we get some of the questions from the audience. And you'll be able to submit questions as we go on using the question and answer function at the bottom of the toolbar at the bottom of the screen, not the chat, but the Q&A function. So now, with those housekeeping notes out there and with my general introduction, I am now going to turn this over to Kaveh. Kaveh, to you.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate the introduction, and also really happy and honored to speak to everyone today. I'm still in London, but hopefully we'll be over in DC in the near future. I mean, really building on what Bob said in his introduction, I wanted to set an international context to the discussions that we're going to be having. In what will be an important week for the United States on international climate action, I think it's worth reflecting that the rest of the world has not been idle on tackling climate change since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. It seems like a long time ago already. Even as the US was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement under the last administration, countries were lining up to join it. And now almost every country on Earth has ratified the Paris Agreement and made commitments under it. The EU, China, and an increasing number of countries have committed to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century. And the United Kingdom, who will be hosting COP26, as well as others, have started to enshrine those net zero commitments in law. And countries are, in increasing numbers, setting near-term targets that are consistent with net zero emissions by mid-century. For example, the European Union has committed to achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, and is currently working to anchor this in legislation. In December, the UK set a new climate target of a 68% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990. And just yesterday, the UK government announced a new 2035 target to cut emissions by just under 80% by 2035 compared to 1990. And importantly, including also aviation and shipping emissions in that target. So the world is moving, and the expectation is that many countries, particularly those of the G20, who are responsible for some 80% of global emissions, will in the coming weeks and months ahead of COP26 come forward with similarly ambitious targets consistent with a mid-century net zero emissions goal. A number of events over the last few years have sought to maintain international momentum since Paris. For example, the UN Secretary General convened world leaders and corporate leaders for a climate action summit at the UN in 2019, launching a number of initiatives to move the dial in the right direction on climate ambition. And together with the incoming COP26 presidency, the Secretary General also convened world leaders again last December on the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement to encourage more countries to come forward with ambitious targets before COP26. And the international climate negotiations process, in that process under the UNFCCC, most of the detailed implementing rules have now been agreed. So the Paris Agreement is functioning and it's operational. And of course, over the last 5 years, there's also been a huge progress on climate action at the subnational level around the world, as well as in the US. Not only is this important in itself, but the momentum generated allows more space for ambitious targets by countries. At the same time, there's no doubt that US re-entry into the Paris Agreement this year has given a much needed boost to international efforts to combat climate change, as has the US's stated intention to achieve net zero emissions. It's clear that the new administration wants to put the US back at the center of international efforts to combat climate change. And in that context, the Biden administration now faces its first test this week when it's expected to announce a new international climate target, or nationally determined contribution, or NDC, under the Paris Agreement. There are high expectations in the international community that the US will commit to a 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. This is largely thought to be consistent with the trajectory for the US to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Just yesterday, the UN Secretary General joined the chorus by saying that he expects the US to come forward with a target of at least 50% reductions by 2030 compared to a 2010 base year, which is slightly more ambitious than a 2005 base year 50% reduction. So it's important for the administration to set an ambitious 2030 target to show the world that the US is serious about achieving net zero emissions, and also to give other countries the confidence to come forward with their own similarly ambitious targets. It's also important that because without ambitious action from the US, we're not going to be able to stay within the temperature limits set by the Paris Agreement. We're still far off track from where we need to be. And according to the International Energy Agency just yesterday, I think, 2021 is set to be the second largest global surge in carbon dioxide emissions in history, despite the economic downturn from COVID-19. So US leadership will be vital to enhancing global climate action. So it's timely then that the president is going to host 40 world leaders this week. And no doubt the US will try to use that event to push major economies to come forward with enhanced climate action to reduce emissions consistent with net zero emissions by 2050. The world will be watching closely to see if other countries respond to the president's call. And the US's own level of ambition will, to a very large extent, determine the outcome of that summit. But looking further ahead, and I think what's of real interest to the discussions today, is that the real test of the US's credibility on climate action will be beyond its headline target. Credibility will depend rather on whether the administration can put in place long-lasting domestic policies and measures that will deliver on the 2030 target and put it on an irreversible path to net zero emissions by 2050. This is going to require a true transformation of every sector of the economy, and it will require the administration to work closely with the business community and others. The US is not alone in facing this challenge of underpinning headline commitments with solid policies. And it's going to be essential that the major economies in particular do just that in the coming months to ensure that a level playing field is present and to prevent carbon leakage across the global economy. In the coming months, it's reasonable to expect that the administration will work with its international counterparts to ensure that they further elaborate and articulate the policies that will deliver on their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So Bob, I hope that this has given everyone some international perspective on our discussions. And I really look forward to hearing the detail and some ideas about how the US can take forward that action domestically. So back to you, Bob.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kaveh. That was a great presentation, and I think well understood on the importance of the upcoming summit that will be occurring this week. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kate Larson, who's the director at the Rodian Group and who leads the firm's Climate Deck Data Service and international climate policy research. Kate specializes in analysis and on the impacts of clean energy policies on the US and international greenhouse gas emissions and strategies for decarbonizing the global economy. She's going to help set some of the larger context as well as we go forward with our panel today. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Bob and Kaveh. I really want to start by setting the stage for where the US is today, how far we've come. And as Kaveh said, we have made some progress in setting the policies that have created a situation for irreversible progress over the last decade. But some of that progress peters out without additional effort over the next decade. And so if we go to our next slide, I'll just start by looking at where is the US today. You can see that we've come a long way. We've reduced emissions significantly below 2005 levels over the last 15 years. We're currently at about 21% below 2005 levels. The bulk of that was due to a steady decline in emissions from the power sector, a transition from coal towards renewables and other zero emission sources. You would think that means that we're right on track, but if we think about what happened in 2020, emissions in 2019 were only about 13% below 2005 levels. So we got a big win in terms of emissions from last year, but that was really on the back of a reduction in economic activity, largely driven by a reduction in transport fuel demand. And that's not how we're going to hit our future goals. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. And on the next slide, look at projections under current federal and state policy. So this reflects all of the state level policies that have been adopted by California and many other leadership states. This reflects our emissions outlook based on commitments by major utilities and other corporates. We are making progress over the past decade, but that really flattens out over the coming decade absent additional policy. We see the power sector starts to lose its momentum largely because the addition of new renewable electricity starts to displace zero-emission nuclear rather than coal, which it had done over the past decade. We also see industrial emissions starting to pick up, and we expect those emissions to outpace transportation by the middle of the decade. An industry that largely is unregulated and has more limited options currently with current technologies to reduce emissions. Next slide. But there's more agreement now than there ever was before about what we need to do. We know we need to decarbonize our power sector. We need to electrify end uses like buildings and vehicles. We need to decarbonize the liquid fuels that fuel aviation and shipping and other hard to electrify sources. We need to reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants like methane from oil and gas production and hydrofluorocarbons. But we also need to ramp up our removal of carbon from the atmosphere through natural solutions as well as industrial carbon removal. And so if the US is going to stay on track to meet the Paris goals, the Paris temperature goals, that largely means that we need to focus on two major efforts. And that is over the next decade, really focusing on where we can make fast, rapid reductions in emissions. And that's largely going to come from the power sector. We have readily available technologies that are affordable and we can deploy quickly. That's wind, solar, storage, and capture. That's going to deliver the bulk of the emission reductions over the next decade, paired with, again, emission reductions from oil and gas methane and HFCs. That'll get the US a good portion of the way toward what we assume may be on the order of 50% emission reduction goal that the Biden administration may announce soon. But reducing emissions over the next decade is super important, but equally important is making the investments in the technologies that we're going to need to reduce emissions from 2030 and beyond. That means fully electrifying buildings and transportation that are going to run on our clean electric grid, getting carbon capture, zero emission liquid fuels, green hydrogen, direct air capture. Investments this decade and those technologies are really what's going to drive the bulk of emission reductions past 2030. Next slide. There's been a lot of talk over the past few months as the Biden administration has put forward their broad goals of where we need to go, how fast we need to get there. And we're quickly moving into a discussion now about how we're going to get there. There are a lot of ways to get there. And I'm going to dig in on the power sector again, where we're going to get the most of our emission reductions, looking at how do we get to a zero carbon electric sector by 2035, as the Biden administration has put forward as a goal. It's likely to be some combination of regulations using executive authority, so regulations of carbon dioxide and other pollutants from our current generation mix, but also other investments and legislative action incentives for clean electricity. And so we have modeled what we think are the most effective combination of those packages of options to reduce emissions from the power sector in a report we released a few weeks back. As you can see, current policy really, including all of the state level commitments, are really not going to make a whole lot of progress past the next few years without additional action. It gets emissions from the power sector down between around 48% below 2005 levels by 2030, but that's not going to be enough. We looked at some limited executive action that includes pollutant controls on coal and CCS for new coal and gas. But again, that's not going to be sufficient to get to zero. Some legislative action is going to be necessary. We looked at some of the proposals on the table for tax credits for renewables. So a 10-year renewable energy tax credit extension. We added in incentives to maintain existing nuclear, which are under threat from cheap natural gas and cheap renewables. And then we also added in some debt relief for coal retirements from co-ops. These are some of the options on the table that we think will make the most emission reduction progress over the next decade. And we found that combined with those limited executive authority actions tailored to work together and complement each other, the US can stay on a pathway towards zero emissions from the power sector by 2035, largely through over the next 7 years. But the progress under those limited actions peters out by the end of this decade. Some additional action will be needed to maintain progress on that path. And we looked at the clean electricity standard that was proposed under Biden's American Jobs Plan. When that's combined with those other activities, we found that will put the US on a straight line path to zero emissions from the electric power sector, reducing emissions about 80% below 2005 levels in 2030. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about how we get there. There are a lot of options on the table, but we find that a combination of tax incentives and other incentives for industry to decarbonize paired with some regulation really helps go the distance. And then quickly on the next slide, looking at industry, which is the largest growing sector of emissions, where we have fewer technologies, but it's clear that there are tools in our tool set to begin to make progress there. The tax extension that was adopted at the end of last year that extended the tax credit for carbon capture on industrial facilities, 45Q. Even that extension of the tax credit really helped to reduce emissions from the electric power sector, curbing growth in emissions over the next few years. There's more that we think that can be done there. These are examples of the tools at our disposal, both through legislative action and executive action to reduce emissions, largely from those sectors where we need to make progress over the next decade and start to make investments that will pave the way for a net zero American economy going forward. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. That was great. It sort of shows what we're up against, but also, a number of different possibilities on how we can use policy and partnership and collaboration to do it. So now we're going to hear from our panelists, and first up is Roger Martella, who is the Director and General Global Counsel for the Global Environment at General Electric. He supervises a team of approximately filled with lawyers and environmental health professionals and protecting EPA's employees on the job, as well as looking forward in the sustainability issues for the company and around the world, not only here in the US, but around the world. So Roger also has to make sure everybody's complying with all these different federal regulations, and we're very happy that you're doing that, Roger. So I'm going to turn it over to you now to tell us where you guys are and what you guys are thinking about at General Electric. Thanks for joining us today, by the way.
Bob, thank you, and thanks to you and to C2ES for organizing this discussion at such a pivotal time, and for all the work that C2ES is doing to kind of emphasize the role of business and being part of the solution to addressing these global challenges. Let me just make it clear at the outset, GE joins many other companies in supporting the president setting an ambitious goal this week, an ambitious NDC, as he looks at our Paris commitment and other things. And we've been very clear and on the record in saying we support an ambitious goal. Our perspective is our North Star towards success focuses on innovation. And if we're going to be successful, I think, in meeting the goals that Kate just walked us through, it really comes down to innovation. And I want to share, I guess, 3 quick things. One is kind of what's our lens in terms of how we think of innovation and how to solve it. Second, what are we doing as a company to start being successful with realizing these goals? And third, I think very significantly, how do we maybe connect the dots on what Kate just showed and use technology to both drive emissions down while building a more resilient grid at the same time? So first of all, in terms of our lens, for those of you who may not be keeping up with General Electric today, we're focused on the energy transition, and we're focused on the future of flight, and we're focused on delivering precision healthcare to all populations in the world. So from the energy transition and climate change perspective, our equipment powers about a third of the world's energy. 90% of the world's power transmission utilities are equipped with our technology. 40% of the world's energy is managed by our software. And we have customers in 170 countries. So we have this very global lens at the entire energy ecosystem. We innovate technology in the renewable energy space. I'll talk about this, gas technology, grid, nuclear, and investing in the future of breakthrough technologies to address these harder to abate emissions. And what this does is it gives us kind of a pathway, a lens to see how technology, again, connects the dots that Kate talked about, what the future could look like, and how you reach kind of an ambitious target in driving emissions down. In terms of our efforts, we've committed to our own carbon neutrality for our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2030. We're strategically focused on delivering and innovating the technology to drive deep decarbonization of the energy sector globally, knowing there's no one-size-fits-all solution for the planet. We've announced our intent to exit from the new coal business, and we invest about $1.5 billion a year in research and development in these areas to make sure that we are leading the innovation of the technology to solve these problems. So with that, how do we actually do there, and what's our lens on how we get there? Again, our goal is to achieve deep decarbonization of the energy sector while at the same time strengthening the resilience of the energy ecosystem at the same time. I'm going to talk about both of these. How do we drive emissions down? How do we make the energy grid, the energy ecosystem more resilient at the same time while we're addressing climate change, a stronger energy grid? We are convinced that these two goals are mutually achievable. So first, in terms of reducing emissions through innovation and technology, obviously we share the goal. We want to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. And we're on a continuum from what we can do in the near term to how we look a little bit at the longer term. In the near term, probably not controversial, the most impactful thing you can do is to grow renewable energy as quickly as possible. In the United States, one of the real untapped areas for renewable energy has been obviously offshore wind. We've already seen in a short time policies come out of the Biden administration that are starting to undo some of the bottleneck and accelerate the ability to develop the offshore wind resources. We deliver that technology. We deliver the Haliade X turbine, which is so far playing a very significant role in the projects that are planned for the offshore, the eastern coast of the United States. This is the largest, most powerful offshore turbine that's built today. So we kind of completely support the notion you got to start with driving down emissions as quickly as possible through renewables. We then look to the role of gas, and we really see the role of gas as having an important role to play to create the foundation, to be a force multiplier for bringing more renewables into the system, for growing renewables. We support controls on methane to address the life cycle of gas emissions, but we also see the role that gas has to play in reducing emissions itself. And when Kate showed the charts of emissions coming down, we see that too, but we don't think it was just renewables that contributed to the emissions coming down. A lot of it was switching to gas as well, actually utilizing more gas between 2005 and 2019 while realizing a 33% reduction in emissions. Longer term, if gas is going to continue to have this role of providing baseload energies for renewables to succeed, we want to invest in breakthrough technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture to decarbonize gas turbines longer term. Our HA turbines today can run off of 50% hydrogen, and we have 70 gas turbines around the world using some type of hydrogen alternative fuel mix today. So we see, again, longer term, the breakthrough opportunities to address these hard to abate emissions with gas turbines by decarbonizing them. And then finally, longer term, we're also investing in innovating other breakthrough technologies like small modular reactors, carbon capture, air capture, energy storage, and things like that to look at this trajectory. So what we can do in the short term versus how we see the future. As we reduce emissions, as I said, we have to make the grid more resilient at the same time. There's a lot of discussion about Texas, and some people point at that, say, hey, maybe this isn't working, we're moving too fast. We see exactly the opposite. We believe that making the grid more resilient, addressing climate change are mutually achievable. And it was a reminder that we do have to focus on modernizing our grid. This is an area that there's opportunities today. There's physical tools that kind of smooths out the variability and allows more electrons to be transmitted today from renewable energy sources, dispersed renewable energy sources, variable renewable energy sources. And importantly, there's digital upgrades too. Opportunities to better get a picture of how to move those electrons, to be able to predict things, to be able to catch things before they happen. So we see this opportunity today for physical and digital upgrades. I'm proud that my CEO My chairman will be standing up after Secretary Granholm this week to be talking about the important role of modernizing the grid from threats in addressing climate change and the near-term economic opportunities that creates in terms of creating jobs, deploying technology today, and addressing the threats of increased weather events, more demand, cybersecurity concerns, and more variability. So we see the pathway, I think, to get to many of the targets that Kate was talking about. We see the pathway to get to an ambitious NDC that we think the president will announce, but we do think that innovation is the North Star, and we're proud to have our role in innovating some of the technology to help realize those solutions. So Bob, thanks again for the opportunity. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, Roger, that was great. All of those technologies and all that innovation is obviously going to be needed, plus some, that there's an intimate interaction between policy that can help stimulate innovation and innovation happening, by spontaneous combustion. No pun intended there. Okay, well, let's go to our next speaker. I see. I have already gotten him smiling. Venu Ganta, who is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Duke Energy. He leads the environmental policy and advocacy for the company and aiming toward accelerating Duke's clean energy transformation. Again, playing in that inner space between corporate ambition and policy to help move it forward. Venu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and appreciate you having me here today. And really C2ES's role in demonstrating that power of government and private sector collaboration to facilitate our transition to a net zero economy is just really so important to bring all of that together. And what an exciting time, right? As the United States rejoins the international conversation, as Bob, as you put, the international arena of how to address climate change, just really, really exciting time. So from the Duke Energy perspective, our climate strategy and our business strategy are completely aligned. We have a net zero goal for our net zero carbon emissions goal from our electricity generation by 2050. We have aligned our business strategy around that with the really critical importance of getting to clean and carbon free while ensuring affordability and reliability to our customers. We also have a net zero goal for our natural gas distribution system, net zero methane emissions by 2030. We've already achieved a lot. We've reduced our carbon emissions from our electric generation by more than 40% below 2005 levels already. We've done that by closing 51 coal units. Roger and Kate talked a lot about that transition. We've transitioned away from coal. We're overseeing the largest coal closure in our industry over the next decade. And part of how we're doing that is right now we own or have contracted for 8,000 megawatts of renewables. And we plan to double that. We have a corporate goal of doubling that by 2025 and tripling that by 2030. And we'll have to go even farther than that. I think Roger did a nice job of talking about the other technologies and the new technologies that are going to be needed. It's not going to be just renewables alone. We have a real opportunity here as we transition to net zero emissions, also promote economic vitality of the communities. Just as an example, over the next 5 years, we'll be investing $59 billion in accelerating the clean energy transition. You can just imagine if that's the next 5 years, what does this look like over the next couple of decades in terms of the amount of investment we're going to make in our communities. Some of that investment, a huge amount of investment is going to be in the backbone, the electric grid, right? Ensuring resiliency and reliability. Maintenance of existing resources is critical. Zero carbon resources like nuclear, we need existing nuclear to stay online if we're going to meet these carbon emission targets. And additional investment in transmission, absolutely critical that we can get that moving. And of course, renewables and energy storage. While that technology changes, our need for a skilled and diverse workforce to maintain, upgrade, and deploy needed technology has never been greater. And we are very committed to building and enabling that diverse workforce to deliver those products and services to customers. Just as an example, we recently made a commitment of $300,000 to support college students of color to jumpstart more career opportunities in energy. And we really think it's super important to get that workforce development, that pipeline of labor to help stand up these new technologies and work in the sector. As we see electric demand grow over time, if we're going to reach our net zero goals, we're going to need a lot of skilled talent, and we're definitely investing in them. And we're definitely investing in our communities. So I'll just close this out by saying, we serve 6 states. We serve 7.4 million customers in 6 states from our electricity service. We have 1.6 million customers for natural gas service. We have an obligation to serve, and our obligation is to deliver reliable, affordable, and carbon-free power and sustainable energy to them over time. But as we work through that, we need to make sure we keep stakeholders and communities front and center. And so it's essential for all of us, businesses, policymakers, all of us, to work together to develop policies that are in the best interest of our communities and best interest of our stakeholders. And for sure, we're going to get there. We'll just need to work together. The necessary component of that transformation, though, is federal leadership. And I think we have that now. And then getting those durable public policies, federal, state, and local levels, that'll help us transition our generating fleet and adopt new low carbon and carbon free technologies and ensure we can get to zero carbon energy while keeping it affordable and reliable for our customers and communities. So with that, Bob, thank you so much for having me here today to provide Duke Energy's perspective, and I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Venu. It's what's one of the things that's interesting is that, in the past 20, 30 years ago, a big part of the capital budget of almost every power company in the United States was pollution control. And now the plants that exist have substantial pollution control on them, but now the investment is in cleaner, more efficient generation capacity or in the transmission system. And so it's much more geared toward solving a whole bunch of problems at the same time together and with the capital budget. So this is really an interesting transition going on. All right, so next up is Idan Dian from IBM. She's Vice President of Corporate and Environmental Affairs at IBM, and she leads a team that is charged with defining IBM's strategy, establishing and maintaining its global environmental management system, and which I think is another way of saying making sure your facilities are in compliance, and then also setting the goals for the environmental, energy, and chemical management that they support with some of their technologies. And we all know technology is going, digital technology is going to be central to many of the innovations that we've already discussed. And so, Don, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Bob, for the kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with fellow panelists. Duke Energy is one of our key suppliers. I see Shell coming up. It's a client, and I'm sure we collaborate with GE in many, many areas. So just quickly, IBM is a hybrid cloud platform and cognitive solutions company. We basically serve clients across industry in all sectors. Whether it's in power sector or transportation, finance, and so forth. And we operate in over 170 countries, and we have about 350,000 employees. A little bit of, I would say we are really among the panelists, we are an end user of energy. Unlike the other three, you all have businesses in power production. And a little bit of background, like all of you, IBM has a longstanding commitment to environmental protection, including addressing climate change. And I will just highlight, for example, our energy conservation program goes back to about 50 years ago. And interesting, I've heard many from Bob to others mention about partnership, right? In 2007, when IBM formalized and published its position on climate change, we in fact called that very item out in the introductory paragraph. The climate change is a serious challenge that requires all of us in the private and public sector to work together. And that is true then and is true today. Like you all, we supported the Paris Agreement in 2015, and we reiterated the support when US withdrew in 2017. And we also believe that there is a place for carbon tax or some incentive that would direct our collective conduct to consider GHG emissions as a business reality that we need to grapple with. So currently, IBM's climate goals includes three things. There are others in the conservation and product development area. I'm not going to get into it, but the three I want to highlight today is first, we want to consume, source 75% of electricity consumption by 2025 and 90% by 2030. We would like to do that with companies like Duke's Help, GE, and we have committed to reduce IBM's greenhouse gas emissions 65% by 2025 against base year 2010. Now, this covers scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions associated with our electricity consumption in what we call third-party operated data centers. Okay, let me go back to the renewable electricity goal to just add one more thing, is we challenge ourselves to not count unbundled RECs against our goal. So what we only count is what we consume, the electrons that actually flow into our operations. Okay, the third goal is to achieve net zero GHG emissions by 2030. Okay, and in addition to that, we are leveraging IBM's research division. We have a world-leading research division to contribute toward accelerating the discovery of materials that may contribute to more efficient absorption of GHG emissions. IBM is not in the business of deploying technology per se, but we have many material scientists, researchers, physicists in our research division, and we are definitely leveraging their talent. So in terms of reducing our own carbon footprint, there are really two main levers to us, to IBM. This is scope 1 and scope 2. First is energy conservation. Invest in efficiency, whether it's fuel that we burn to heat buildings or primarily really it's electricity. So first, reduce our demand. But largely, we have to rely upon the availability of renewable electricity for us to achieve our goals. That's it. That is the biggest lever, renewable electricity. Okay, so I'll come back to that later. As a IT company, our greatest contribution really is through our value chain, through how we serve our clients. Our emissions, relatively speaking, it's lower than other more energy intensive sectors or companies, but we have a role to play to help our clients. And our solutions really, we help clients in all sectors, as I said earlier. We help agricultural clients to do digital farming, to do better prediction, better forecasting, reducing their consumption of fertilizers, all of that feed into lesser emissions in the value chain. Right, we work with power sectors I think Roger mentioned earlier about weather prediction, response, and IT and digital solutions plays a key role in that space. Transportation, similarly, how can we help transportation companies to operate more efficiently by whether it's flying their planes, prediction, ground operations, and obviously manufacturing sectors as well. So the possibility of applying big data and digital technology is really endless, and we continue to invest in those space. Of course, that's both good for the environment and good for our business. Okay, so just a couple of quick words about USNDC. So IBM supports a USNDC that is aligned with the goals of Paris Agreement, and indeed, we support US taking a leadership role by example, first by setting ambitious goals and follow through by delivering results to back it up. So we are 100% behind US taking the leadership role. We're happy to see US back in the climate accord, and we look forward to working with the US government to do our contribution. Let me just see. And finally, a couple of words about how we envision renewable electricity. What do we see that's necessary as an end user? And to us, there are many companies, large companies with large demands. They have invested in generation, and that's very commendable and necessary. However, we believe to achieve the goal of broad adoption of renewable electricity, the renewable electricity must be available and affordable to all. I mean, the previous Venu said it very well. I mean, he's in the business, he said it, and I'll just echo what he said. It has to be available. And we have worked as a company, Ibm has worked very closely with our electricity suppliers in every locale. We send a strong signal to them that we want more clean energy. We want them through the grid. And to that, I would just end by saying that I think it was Roger or someone else said before that digitization, grid security, clean power, climate change, those are all goals. They are mutually beneficial to one another, and they must coexist really for us to be successful. So with that, Bob, I will end my prepared remark and I look forward to participating in discussions.
Okay, Adon, thank you. Thank you so much. Really, we're looking at the spectrum here. We have, manufacturing of some of the technologies we need. We have the deployment of the technologies of the power sector. We have a consumer of the technology plus a provider of additional digital technology to help implement the other technologies. So you can see these interrelationships. Now, Glenn Wright is joining us. Actually, he's been here very patiently waiting, and we really appreciate that, Glenn. He's Vice President of Renewables and Energy Solutions at Shell, where he leads the American power business, the American side of the power business. He brings 30 years of experience in industrial and commodity markets, to this current role that he has. And his background includes technology, the good old mergers and acquisitions, trading, risk management, and business development. I mean, it takes all of these skills when you start to think of the transformation that large, multifaceted energy companies like Shell are undergoing. And so, Glenn, we're looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts on this before we go to a general discussion. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. So thanks so much for having me. Now at Shell, we are transforming our business as our progress. One of our guiding objectives is to achieve our target of becoming a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner, in step with society's progress towards the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. That means reducing emissions from our own operations and from the fuels and other energy products we sell to our customers. At the same time, we are investing in new opportunities, providing more low carbon energy, such as biofuels and hydrogen, as well as charging for electric vehicles and generating electricity from solar and wind power. But these renewable and low carbon businesses can only succeed if there is robust demand for this kind of energy. That is why we strongly support this administration's call to raise the ambitions for America's nationally determined contributions for 2030. This step would incentivize businesses and consumers to choose low and zero carbon energy solutions. Shell is well positioned to support the 2030 indices across multiple sectors. From our solar power producer in Nashville to our hydrogen fuel stations across California, to our investment just last week in a sustainable aviation fuel producer near Atlanta. Shell Energy North America is one of the country's top 3 power wholesalers, and more than a third of that power comes from renewable sources. Now, many consumers know us best for our more than 13,000 US retail locations, one of the largest refueling networks in the country. This is an excellent platform to build out electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We've acquired a company called Greenlots that has 7,500 charging points and provides a software platform to optimize charging for EV drivers. To strengthen these and other low carbon businesses, we trust in the value of our partnerships with governments and with the private sector. Take low carbon aviation fuel as an example. Now, theoretically, we could multiply our investment in sustainable aviation fuel, making it available at all of the 900 plus airports Shell serves today. But most aircraft, they're not certified to fly with that fuel. And it's costly. It costs significantly more than traditional jet fuel. So it's not a competitive choice for airlines. Rather, we must work with aircraft manufacturers and airlines, with airports and major airline users. All have a role to play alongside government in stimulating and accelerating demand for sustainable aviation fuel. Soon, we hope more aircraft will be certified and the fuel will come down in cost. Then as demand grows, we will increase our investments, and you can see how a virtuous cycle can gain momentum. Ambitious NDCs are part of that formula. But even more can be done to strengthen incentives for investment in low carbon technology and infrastructure. A carbon price is one such tool. Among other things, it could create and accelerate development of carbon capture and sequestration, a technology that we all agree is essential to meeting the goals of Paris. I will close by emphasizing that the challenge ahead goes far beyond emissions. We must reduce carbon while also ensuring that Americans have reliable powers and fuel. We must do it while protecting the environment, and we must strive to make absolutely certain that no one is left behind in the journey to net zero. This must be a just energy transition, one where the benefits are shared equitably. So on behalf of Shell, I applaud the administration's climate ambitions, and I look forward to working with governments, corporate partners, and organizations like C2ES to build a future economy that respects nature, one that is able to provide safe, reliable, and affordable energy to all American families while driving toward net zero. Thank you so much.
Okay, Glenn. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think I've unmuted myself.
Good.
Great presentations, everybody. You all mentioned a number of different things, and Kate, you hold on for a second, because this first question is really going to be for some of the business panelists here, but I'm going to come back and ask you a related question. I emphasized in the beginning, and I think every one of you emphasized a little bit about the partnership between government and businesses, all who seem to be aligned now over what we need to do between now and the middle of the century. Get to net zero somehow, some way by the middle of the century. Every one of you will have a slightly different role to play in harder and different transitions. Glenn, I really appreciate the fact that you brought up, the customers and the citizens and the sharing equitably of the benefits, and which I think sometimes we focus on the inequitable impacts, which are true and need to be dealt with, but there's also the equitable sharing of the benefits as they start to unfold, which is really, really important. So in this partnership thinking, I'm going to ask each one of you, and we'll just go in the order that you spoke at the beginning, Roger, which means we'll start with you, is, given this partnership and given all the discussions that are going on, if you could wave your magic wand, what two policies do you think would be most advantageous to helping you achieve the goals you set? And I'll start with you, Roger. It's a very simple question, actually.
So the top two, that's not so simple. I have a much longer ideas, but
sure.
I think in order to achieve our goals, I would start first of all with the theme of partnership. I think, I would propose that I think traditionally, when we looked at an administration and its time in office, they've frequently been measured success or not success by how many regulations did they promulgate, how many cases they win or lose in court, things like that. Regulations will be part of this for sure, but I would propose that really shouldn't be how we judge the success of this administration. I think this administration has the chance to say, we're going to set these targets. We're going to use all the tools in the toolbox to come up with binding ways to make sure we realize these targets. They may not be all federal regulations. There may be some congressional component. There may be states involved. There may be agreements among us on this call and our customers and our competitors to show how we're going to do this. But I think we have to be more flexible and look beyond kind of the traditional metrics we've used to be successful here, and realize, because we are coming at this with a very collaborative partnership type approach, let's focus on the end game here and how we can be creative and get there, and do that as quickly as possible, because we don't have a lot of time to waste on some of these issues. Second, I think the other thing I'd say from our perspective, being this very global 170 country focus, is that we have to be thinking about what I said earlier. There is no one size fits all solution to this. We want to approach this at a global level. We want to make energy affordable and accessible to everybody. And we want to help, all these countries succeed in their NDCs and succeed in building a renewable energy infrastructure. But that's going to look very different in different places. So I think one thing we want to be thoughtful about is, while we may have really well intentions about trying to help all these different economies be successful, we have to look at the particulars and the specifics of the situation and tailor kind of our solutions to help them realize these goals long term. And that's going to look very different in very different places. We should avoid kind of overgeneralizations in terms of what might work here, might work there. So those would be my two, I guess, policy priorities, Bob.
Been muting myself now to make sure that you guys don't get feedback through my through my ear pods. There's plenty of feedback in my own brain to begin with. So Venu, I'm going to come to you next. Let me rephrase it a little bit, because I don't want to put any of you on the spot. They say these are the top two that I must have. Two important policies that can help, in your case, Venu, Duke, achieve those very ambitious goals that have been laid out, but of which there's obvious policies that can help you implement those. So I'll turn it over to you, Venu.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Really appreciate that question. And I think, Roger hit a really good point around partnership, right? It's really critical that businesses working together with governments of all levels. And to Roger's point about global, it's also hyper-local, right? All our states, all our jurisdictions and municipalities and communities are so different, right? And they're going to have different paths. It's really important to bring those communities and our customers forward in this conversation. I'll just mention a couple of things from the policy side. We're definitely going to need support for existing technologies that are providing a lot of zero carbon energy right now, like existing nuclear. It's really important that we continue to maintain those opportunities to extend the life of our nuclear reactors. We're going through the relicensing process right now. We think it's really critical we have support for that. There's lots of economic development and jobs associated with those as well. There has to be a role for natural gas. Certainly in the near term to continue, I think Roger put it well, to continue to facilitate the closure of coal in the near term. In the out years, as we see it, balance the grid with more intermittent sources. Having that dispatchable generation is really critical. And then going forward, I think you touched on it, Bob, about R&D, right? It absolutely needs to be there. We're going to need, and Roger, you did a good job of summarizing, new zero emitting technologies, right? Advanced nuclear, green hydrogen, right? That's going to really be essential to incorporate into the existing turbines we have now. A really critical source capture and storage, and obviously long duration energy storage are all going to be critical. So I look in the near term, we need a few things there around nuclear. Natural gas would be helpful in facilitating having very clear targets around that and support, and then the out years clear support for our D&D.
Okay, thanks, Venu. Those are pretty good ones. I put some of those on my own list if I had one, which of course I don't know. C2ES has one. Idan, in order to help IBM accomplish some of the goals and some of the support structure that you also have, what federal policies could help move that forward or accelerate it?
I mentioned earlier about making renewable electricity broadly available, which includes, in my view, both generation and the grid resiliency. So they really needs to go together. I think the policy needs to be in place to recognize, to invest, to enable, to incent, to provide credits and whatnot to really allow companies or operators to invest not just in a generation capacity, but also the grid itself. And when I talk about grid, it must include digitization of the grid, not just physical grid. So I want to emphasize that that has to be a key policy objective. And I think it was Glenn mentioned earlier about the equity just, and I know this probably will come up later again. And to me, that I wholeheartedly agree. And that's what I meant when I say it has to be broadly available. It has to be affordable to all, not those who are able to pay a premium, right? And then on top of that, I'm speaking for IBM because we know that firsthand in some of the markets in the US is very difficult because of the current regulation. I'm not opining on they're good or bad. In some of the regulated markets, it's very difficult to get our hands on renewables. So that is one policy space. Second, we always think research is important. I think it was Kate mentioned earlier about removal technologies. I think there's so much that we are yet to discover, to innovate. So I think focus in promoting research and innovation within this country will be huge.
Hey, thanks, Idan. And Glenn, obviously you outlined a number of places where transformation is taking place at Shell. In a supporting environment with the government, what policies would really be? You did mention carbon pricing, but beyond that, perhaps, or if you want to add that in, go ahead.
Well, let me emphasize that one first, because we are strong advocates of carbon pricing policy. And we're strong advocates because we believe it promotes a mechanism that ensures the most efficient reduction in emissions can come about. Those who are best positioned to offer and deliver lower emissions are incentivized to do so. It also potentially creates a market that allows it to be done in a more effective and efficient way. So I like to emphasize that because we fundamentally believe it is a part and a necessary part to driving towards net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. So that's why I just want to emphasize. The other one I like to emphasize is support for infrastructure. And I tell the story, I happen to live in Texas, but let me just tell very quickly. Many people don't know that Texas happens to be the largest wind energy producer in the United States, larger in fact than the next 3 states combined. Now, most of that wind is generated in West Texas, but most of the consumption is in the East or the North, call it Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, San Antonio. And the reason this is possible is because there's infrastructure, there's high voltage transmission that moves it from the West to the load zones. And that makes it possible. And that was put in place in a substantial way around 2014. My point is, but for the infrastructure, the opportunity to leverage the wind energy would not be available to us. So anything that we can do in the space of helping to support the right kind of infrastructure for a low carbon energy future, where there's a hydrogen economy, et cetera, is good. So policies that support infrastructure.
Okay. Now, I was waiting for somebody to bring that up. And Kate, this is going to zero in on my question for you. Obviously, you guys are observers of all these policies and policy options. And I take it from your presentation, you've given at least a slight look at the Biden jobs infrastructure bill. And I was going to ask you, and Glenn already picked one out, but if you look at that bill in its totality, obviously it's got schools as well as broadband. But what would you think in it? You mentioned and actually modeled, I think, a little bit around their clean energy standard. But what are some of the important things that are in the infrastructure? If you're out there as a business and you're trying to figure out your decarbonization pathway, and you're looking for the federal government to provide some some of the fundamental, backbone stuff. What do you see in that proposal that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think setting the direction, the vision for the next decade in terms of what we're aiming for, and providing some of the incentives to get there, I think is largely the framework that's necessary. But as others have mentioned, it's both about setting the frame for the type of new work that will be available and making sure all communities have access to those jobs. It's focused on grid and other infrastructure that may not be roads and bridges, but is critical to the security of our economy. We just released a report today that assessed the jobs impact of a package of likely potential components of the American Jobs Plan. Again, the details within that plan are not specific enough to know exactly what the incentive package would be for clean energy, but we modeled a representative package and found that on net, the plan could produce as many as 600,000 new jobs each year over the next decade. So from 2022 forward, on net, and that the new jobs created, and that's from everything from new renewable installations to grid improvements and others, that's on net about 600,000 a year, again, on average. And that's really overwhelmingly larger than any losses to traditional fossil infrastructure. And so again, the devil is in the details, but I think the broad package that we've talked about, retaining existing nuclear, reinforcing and investing in our grid, and then setting a long-term vision for the next decade. So we have a cycle of extending renewable electricity tax credits, for example, 1 year at a time. It doesn't give our industry partners much to plan on. And again, I think that sort of long-term vision is really what's critical.
Yeah, I think, in the very classic sense, and again, almost everybody has touched on this, and you just outlined, Kate, a number of them. We may have had 110 years ago an emerging technology called the internal combustion engine attached to a wagon, henceforth now known as the automobile. But people were buying them, but all they did is get stuck in the mud. And then all of a sudden, local governments, then eventually the federal government got involved to build a transportation system to accommodate that new technology. And so today's highways, might be things that Adon works on at IBM. There's the broadband and the internet, and there's the wires to move the electricity from one side of Texas to the other. Glenn, hopefully someday those wires will get connected to the rest of the country too. I know that's a big job to interconnect all the big interconnects in the country, but they will become more resilient if they are. And I won't get into some of the history on that, but so I think the basic charging stations for the automobiles, so that there's consumer confidence. So a lot of these things set the tone for what you just said at the end, Kate. Is a little bit of stability and certainty to the businesses who have to make the investments, because private capital is going to ultimately not the federal government, but private capital is going to be needed to be driven it. Again, one of the things you do by pushing with a price on carbon, as Glenn has pointed out, it makes it move private capital in one place or the other. And I think for our sake here at C2ES, we think big on infrastructure and what is infrastructure, because it changes over time, as I just outlined, between trying to get rid of the muddy roads, in the suburbs of New York City in 1913, compared to, highways of electrons that we need now. So the federal government wants to not only help, or at least there's proposals out on how to build some of this fundamental work to support the commitments and the drive for private capital, but it also has pronounced that the whole government approach, they want to become an example. They want to set a tone. They want to buy some of this equipment. They want to, work with the digital and technology companies. Now, many of you have been out there implementing these things, or trying to, and so if the federal government wants to lead by example, I'm going to ask each one of you, and here you just have to give an example. What have you learned that you would tell the federal government they should think about as trying to be an example? I'm going to go backwards this time, and so Kate, you get to go again. Here's your chance. What would you tell them?
Exempt from this list.
Oh, I'm bringing you in.
What, can you repeat the lesson broadly?
Yeah. So the federal government is trying to lead by example. Many of you've observed many of the companies and local governments who are out there actually doing it in the last 4 years. What would you say as an advice would you have for the federal government as they try to lead by example?
I think, again, it is looking at where we can make early wins with an eye to the future, and communicating the story of why we're doing this and who benefits. And I think that's something, because it is a fundamental transformation of the entire economy. It's really, and I think the Biden administration has done this well, is it's about jobs, it's about the health of our communities, and it's about the integration of all of these types of infrastructure into the solutions that we need. It's building a modern America. And I think that when it, the subnational entities that have done this well have really built it into the fabric of creating a modern society, that it's not just environmental regulation, that it really is designing the future and doing that with an eye to where we need to be, in 2050 and working backwards from that.
Okay, Glenn, what advice would you have for the federal government? They come and sit in the federal government comes and sits in your office and says, "Jeepers, Glenn, what should we do to lead by example?" What would you tell them to do?
Well, one of the things I think about when leading by example, by definition, means doing things first ourselves. When I think about Shell, one of the things I focus on is, what are we explicitly doing in our own operations? What are we explicitly doing in our own activities to decarbonize the way we do business? It provides far and away the best example, which is why when we talk about our ambitions, we always talk about not only decarbonizing our own activities, but also then working with our customers to help them decarbonize. That's leading by example. So the question then is, where can the federal government explicitly look at activities that we are specifically engaged in and apply exactly the technologies and the techniques that we're discussing here today?
Yeah. Before I go to Idan, I want to say to the audience, before I keep going on this, if you want to ask a question, go to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and type in a question, and our operators are standing by to take your questions and deliver them over here so that we can ask them of the panel. It could be a specific question for a specific panelist or a general question. So Idan, federal government shows up in your office. They want to help. They want your help.
Yeah, well, let me go back to what Glenn said. It's so important. It's kind of like eating your cooking. I would love to see them also try to buy renewables off the grid. I think that would help them understand what are the difficult markets that we need to work on. But more broadly, I think we have an opportunity in front of us to communicate this story more broadly. The story, what I meant by the story is the components that I mentioned, whether it's from infrastructure to justice to jobs, they all really work together. So I think government can take a more explicit role, so people don't think infrastructure as, quote, just physical infrastructure. When you think about grid, just to take the grid alone, right? Cybersecurity, for example, is a huge area. For the grid to be reliable, to be affordable, you got to have the components in there. Comes with that component are very good jobs, what we call new collar jobs and so forth. So I think to get buy-in, to get people rally behind the government, and I think that feeds into certainty of sustaining the credits, giving business more certainties. When the population understands the bigger picture, I think that helps.
Okay. Benu?
Well, I know we touched on a couple points before on the policy side of the couple things we want the administration to do potentially, and I think one thing I would just emphasize is the power sector, as Kate alluded to at the beginning, has gone farther faster already with regard to carbon emission reduction. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned there in terms of engagement with stakeholders, engagement with our states and communities, and moving forward. One area I would definitely touch on, and I'm glad Glenn brought it up earlier, is around infrastructure, because we're going to have to build a lot of stuff in a short period of time. And I think Kate has the exact numbers. So we've looked at, building, 1,600 megawatts of renewables every year for the next 30 years, right? And to get there, we probably need to have a more rational process around permitting and siting, right? We definitely need to keep communities in mind. I'm glad Glenn brought up the environmental justice and equity. We need to have communities have a central focus and role in that, but we also need to figure out a way how to build a clean energy infrastructure better and faster than the way we're doing it now. The other thing I would say there is clearly, as we see the electric sector move towards net zero, it's an opportunity. And I've heard it a lot today for electrification of other sectors, right? So electric vehicle, transportation, electrification infrastructure could be a key focus for the federal government forward in getting to a net zero economy.
Okay, Roger, some thoughts from you on advice for the federal government? Yeah. You're here to help them?
Well, forgive me, I'm going to sound a little like a broken record, but yes, my advice would be partnership and collaboration. If what we really care about at the end of the day is realizing these goals, realizing these ambitious goals, getting to the NDC, there's no one entity, as powerful as the government is, as global as our footprint is as GE, there's no one entity that can do this without a lot of partnership across diverse stakeholders, both to innovate technology and to bring all these pieces together. So if they want to be successful, it really needs to be a partnership approach. You're hearing a lot of enthusiasm by folks on this phone for being part of that partnership. And there's lots of people who aren't here who I'm sure share that. I think to their credit, we're seeing that this week. I mean, I'm seeing in all these events, it's not just the White House touting out government officials to say what they want to do. I think they have been pretty inclusive. We're participating in 2 events this week with the White House we've been invited to. We're honored for that. So I'd like to see that maybe as a sign of things to come, that there's going to be very much this partnership collaboration approach that really focuses on the end goal here of getting these emission reductions and bringing these parties together with the innovation, the technology, and the creativity to get there.
Okay, so I've got a bunch of questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to try to synthesize a little bit and distribute them here. So we got about 10 minutes to go here, and I think we can get a number of these things. So for Glenn and Roger, talk about hydrogen. Roger, you brought up hydrogen. Glenn, obviously, it's a major element of hydrocarbons. Just quickly, a couple of points about how you're thinking about hydrogen in the future for use in turbines or for using in making hydrogen without emissions for fuel cells or whatever. So Roger, you were just talking about. Well, I'll go right back to you.
Very committed to hydrogen being part of the future. We know there are emissions that are going to be hard to abate that are going to be with us, and hydrogen is a key to addressing that. We're designing turbines today for that future adaptability. As I mentioned, our HA turbines can run 50% off of hydrogen. We have 70 turbines in the world that are using some type of hydrogen or alternative fuels. We recognize that this is a breakthrough technology. I don't want to oversell it and say tomorrow we can run turbines on hydrogen, but what we're doing is we're looking at that trajectory to design the technology today that can be applied in the future. And so, helping as I said, collaboration and partnership with other parts of the supply chain to bring the fuel into the picture in a sustainable way so that we can use them then in the turbines.
Yeah, we are quite excited about hydrogen and the opportunity. When we look at our global renewables and energy solutions business, we have an entire business devoted to this because the reality is we believe the hydrogen economy is evolving. Is it super cost effective today? No, but it will evolve in due course. And we are focused on both green hydrogen, that is to say, producing hydrogen using renewables, as well as blue hydrogen, which is to say, using perhaps traditional technologies, but using carbon capture and sequestration, therefore to make it clean. So in order for us to evolve to the point that we can actually effectively use hydrogen as a fuel, which is exactly directionally where we need to go, we also have to make certain that we can produce hydrogen cost effectively. But we certainly see that on the horizon.
Yeah, cost effectively and without the emissions that you get from making it in the current way with from methane. So a number of questions have come up about the relationship between some of the things Kate said about the employment, the 600,000, I think was the number, Kate, that you used, that some of the analysis you guys have done. There's a certain geography to these employment numbers. When we talk about transition and concepts like just transition, where there are communities that have some integrated in a fossil fuel kind of way, whether it's a mining or whether it's a small town that has a power plant, coal-fired or other power plant. Glenn, whether it's the extraction part, of natural gas. Can maybe let's just limit this so we can get a couple more questions in. Glenn, you and Venu talk a little bit about the geography of the job creations that Kate was talking about in the analysis that they had done. And Kate, if you want to chime in on the geography as opposed to just looking at the national economy, that would be welcome. But I know that I'm going to guess you probably looked at a national kind of span there. But anyway. Venu, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, no, great question. Appreciate that, Bob. Well, certainly. We've closed 51 coal units already. So we've been through a lot of these experiences working with communities, obviously working with first of all, with our workforce, right? Helping to transition them to new jobs, helping to train them for the new opportunities of the next generation and the transition of the energy system. So part of our key focus right now is really engagement of communities. We're both looking at sort of what's been called just transition. We're also looking at environmental justice, really embedding ourselves in communities and understanding what this transition really means for them. And having honest conversations with them about infrastructure siting, right, around the next generation of opportunities. I think when we looked at the American Jobs Plan, there's a lot in there, right, that speaks to RD&D opportunities, R&D opportunities, or other infrastructure opportunities that could help disadvantaged communities. We've seen the definition of disadvantaged communities expand a little bit to recognize that fossil fuel dependent communities that are seeing coal closures are disadvantaged as well, right? So we need to address both sides of that. Those that are affected right now by fossil fuels or legacy pollution, and those that will be affected in the transition. So we're continuing to work through that as we continue to close coal and transition. We're continuing to work with communities closely, and we think there's a really critical role for the federal government and the state government and policymakers to be involved in this conversation.
Glenn, one of the things that I found interesting in the jobs infrastructure proposals that the Biden administration made was a big federal investment in capping old wells, which obviously would be an employment issue in certain of those areas. But how has Shell been thinking about some of the potential geographic disparities and the job creation versus job loss?
This is a challenging topic, to be sure, right? Even if I think just internally to Shell, we are traditionally a gas company, right? But we're talking about transitioning to be more of a fulsome energy company. And so we have to think in the context, not only just in terms of the employee value proposition that we have a transitioning workforce over time. But we always emphasize that we power progress together by providing more and cleaner. It's important that we are aware and cognizant of both. More because society needs more, cleaner because we're doing things to make certain that we mitigate emissions. The reality is, in many instances, traditional sources of energy will be around for some time. Our objective is to transition it in an intelligent way that is economically viable while also meeting our objectives of going to a low carbon energy future. So it's not a trivial task. It's not an easy way to come, but that's directionally the way we think about it.
Okay.
I'll just add in quickly, the 600,000 net additional jobs each year that I referenced was just from the investments in the power sector. So transmission, renewable build outs.
Okay.
There's much more when you talk about, dealing with old wells, with the electric vehicle infrastructure work. So that was just a small piece. And of course, when you look at it in its entirety, there's more to be discovered there, and we will be releasing that work over the course of the summer.
All right. So we're getting tight on time here, and there's three more subject areas that I think are really important. One is nature-based solutions and also direct air capture and what role that can play in addition to low carbon aviation fuels. The other one is electrification. We talked a little bit about vehicles, but the word, people have asked questions about buildings and, what is, what is involved with all of that. So I'm gonna ask anybody who wants to chime in on any of those subjects, just start going, unmute yourselves and go.
I'll say quickly, we need to do all of those things. So yes, and yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the, go ahead. Glenn, were you going to say something?
I support that. We've got to do all of them. And I will speak just very briefly to nature-based solutions. We think that's a critical part as well, because we recognize there are hard to decarbonize sectors. And therefore, until such time we have more efficient ways of doing so, we want to look to nature as a huge carbon sink, as well as to technology as a carbon sink. Kate spoke to this, I think is really key.
Yeah. I mean, that lower part of your graph, Kate, that you had going down to, someplace near zero by 2050 had a big, sink part to it. The current U.S. inventory has about a 10% lop off for sinks currently, but that's changing perhaps with the Western forest dilemmas and everything. Anybody else have thoughts on these couple of subjects here?
Yeah, Bob, and I would just add that all of the above clearly, but then if you recognize there are certain sectors that need these external technologies more, and I think just place the emphasis on the importance to invest and to incent investment in energy efficiency. Bob, you mentioned buildings, right? Yeah. Anything that consumes energy, we need to help them consume less. So we provide the contingency for those sectors that really needs the technology to handle. So
yeah, and again, that was the top line on Kate's chart, right? If I remember it correctly.
It's a very small sliver, though. Yeah, very small sliver, if I remember.
Yeah, I think one of the messages here from this last little bit is that there isn't a silver bullet. I mean, if I could use that term. I mean, there's no room for error here, and we have to develop all of these and continue developing all of these different approaches. And some may wane and grow, and some may shrink, but we definitely can't put aside one because and this is. I used to call this a circular firing squad, where all the different solutions would get around and all yell at each other saying, we're the one that's going to solve this problem. Please go away, nuclear power plants, or please go away, carbon capture, or please go away, offshore wind or batteries. And the truth is we need to have all of these things. So, all right, well, I'm afraid I've managed to use up the last minute myself. And I really want to thank all of you for joining us today. My final point to the audience and to all of you is that I think what we're seeing this week and what we've seen on this panel is there's an alignment between what the public and what the government is thinking about doing and what the business community is wanting to do. By the middle of the century, the issue of how do we get from where we are today to there is going to require an intimate relationship between policy, incentives, consumer acceptance, and business investment. And really, that is going to be key. We no longer, I think, need to tell business this is what you need to do. We need to figure out how to help work together to get it done, which is a slightly, I think, improved model going forward. So thanks everybody for participating. I know we went over about a minute. I appreciate the audience who's hung in there, and that we'll call it a panel. We'll call it done. Kate, thanks. Adon, Roger, Glenn, Venu, thank you guys.